Ever stopped and thought about, when you grab some medicine from your cabinet, how do you just know it's going to do what it says and that it's safe to take?
Yeah.
That trust, that's what we're going to dig into today. We're talking about current good manufacturing practices,
cGMP.
cGMP, the foundation of making sure all those meds and pills and everything are actually safe and actually work.
You bet. And you've pulled together a really interesting collection of materials for this. We're talking FDA regulations,
Yeah.
guidelines, the whole 9 yards of how medicines are made. So I guess our mission today is to break all that down, right? To understand the core of cGMP and all those regulations and really see how they impact the quality and safety of the drugs we all use.
Absolutely. We'll be diving into the Code of Federal Regulations. That's the 21 CFR. We'll touch on dietary supplements a bit. That's part 111. But really zoom in on part 211, the heart of it all for finished pharmaceuticals. And of course, we can't forget the global perspective. We've got to bring in the International Council for Harmonization, the ICH. Plus, we've got insights from FDA, training materials, and what folks in the industry are saying so we can get a complete picture, but, one that doesn't make your head spin.
Yeah, for sure. By the end of this deep dive, you'll really grasp those cGMP fundamentals. You'll get why the FDA is so important and understand the huge role of what we call quality culture in making sure medicines are made the right way.
Okay, let's rewind a bit. How did we even get to this whole GMP thing in the first place? It wasn't like, medicines were always made to these high standards, right?
Yeah. You're right. The very beginning, if you can believe it, goes all the way back to 1906 here in the U.S. We had the Pure Food and Drug Act. That was huge, at least for its time, to ensure food and drugs were pure, especially when they were sold across state lines. It was like the first baby step towards protecting consumers.
So that was like the initial spark then.
Yeah, you could say that. But the real push towards the modern cGMP we know today, that came from some pretty tragic situations. One that keeps popping up in your sources, for instance, is the sulfanilamide elixir disaster back in 1937. It's a stark reminder of why we need cGMP.
Oh yeah, that was a terrible incident.
A company decided to use, get this, diethylene glycol to dissolve this drug, to make it a liquid. Problem is, we know now that stuff is toxic, really toxic.
And the worst part, there were no rules back then to even test if that new liquid form was safe before people started taking it.
Exactly. Safety testing wasn't required by the regulations at the time. It's a really sad story, but it forced everyone to wake up and realize making sure a drug was pure, that wasn't enough. You had to test it, make sure it was safe before giving it to people.
It's kind of wild to think how those awful events from so long ago shaped how we make safe medicines today.
It is. Really makes you appreciate what we have now.
So, fast forward to today's cGMP. What's like the big idea, the core principle behind it all?
At its heart, it's quality by design. Don't just check the final product. Make sure every step, every part is made to a high standard right from the start. Like if you're building a car, you wouldn't just try to start it at the end and hope it works, right?
Right.
You'd make sure every single part from the engine to the brakes is made to exact specifications so you know it's going to run smoothly and safely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
In pharmaceuticals, it means we don't just test quality at the end. We build it in every step of the way. That's cGMP. It's proactive, preventing problems before they even have a chance to pop up.
Build it in, not just test it out at the end. I like that. Like when you're cooking, you can't just hope the final dish tastes good. You got to have the right ingredients, and you got to follow the recipe carefully.
Perfect analogy. And to do this right in the pharmaceutical world, we need a deep understanding of critical quality attributes, or CQAs. This applies to both the raw drug substance and the final drug product.
CQAs. Can you give us an example of what one of those would be?
Sure. Imagine you have a headache and take a pain reliever. The CQA would be confirming it actually has the correct amount of pain-relieving ingredient in each pill, not more, not less. That's what assay is all about.
Okay, I see. So that's one example.
Then there's identity, confirming it really is the drug it says it is. No mix-ups, no substitutions. Purity is another big one, ensuring there's no contamination, no nasty stuff that shouldn't be there. These are just the basics, the building blocks. The Certified Pharmaceutical GMP Professional Handbook goes into even more detail on this. Depending on what the medication is, there might be other CQAs that are really important, like if it's something you inhale, particle size matters, or if it's an injection, well, it has to be sterile, free of any bacteria.
So basically, you're carefully controlling all these specific things throughout the whole process to make sure the final product is good. Now, who's making sure all this happens? Who's in charge of keeping everyone in line?
In the U.S., that's the FDA's job, the Food and Drug Administration. They're the ones who set the rules of the game, for cGMP and then make sure everyone's playing by those rules.
Right, the FDA. They're the referees, making sure no one's cutting corners, and those rules, they're all laid out in the Code of Federal Regulations, the 21 CFR, right?
Exactly. And within the 21 CFR, there are a bunch of parts that are super relevant to cGMP. You might be surprised to know that GMP isn't just for pharmaceuticals. Parts 110 and 111, for example, they cover GMP for food and dietary supplements.
Wait, really? So those protein powders and vitamins, they're made following GMP too?
To some extent, yes. Now, the specific rules are a bit different compared to pharmaceuticals, but the main idea is the same. Clean facilities and equipment, no contamination, proper control of how things are made. You see this in the Interpharm CRC Press Index for those parts of the CFR. The EAS Consulting Group even has a whole video on 21 CFR 111 for dietary supplements.
Okay, interesting. So it's a broader set of principles, but if we're talking about the prescriptions and over-the-counter meds we all use, Part 211, that's the main one, right?
That's the heart of it for pharmaceuticals. Part 211 is broken down into subparts, and each one dives deep into a key aspect of drug production. Let's start with subpart C, which is all about the buildings and facilities.
Buildings and facilities might sound simple, but I'm guessing it's a lot more than just having a building, right?
Oh yeah, way more. This subpart is all about clean sanitary conditions. We're talking no pests like rodents or insects. Imagine those in a place where they're making medicines. Yuck. Then you've got proper waste disposal, which is super important to prevent any kind of contamination.
Makes sense. You don't want anything nasty getting into the medicines.
Right. And Section 211.56 of the CFR and the Bleasner Audit Guide, they both emphasize this. But it's not just about cleanliness, it's also about space. You need enough room to do everything properly to prevent things from getting mixed up, especially in the labs where they do all the testing.
Oh, yeah. I can imagine how cramped conditions could lead to mistakes.
Exactly. The EAS Consulting Group talks about this in one of their videos. They emphasize that even lab areas need enough space so they can do all those critical tests safely and accurately.
Okay, so we've got clean, well-designed facilities with enough space. What about the actual equipment they use to make all those medicines? I'm guessing that's where Subpart D comes in, right? That covers equipment.
You got it. Subpart D gets really specific about how the equipment is designed, how it's built, how it's maintained. And they're big on cleaning, of course, but also on a really important concept called qualification.
Qualification, that sounds pretty official. What does that involve?
It's basically a whole process to show, with proof, that the equipment they're using can actually do what it's supposed to do and that it does it right, consistently. Think of it like this. You buy a brand new oven. You want to make sure it works properly, right?
Oh, yeah, of course.
So first, you check if it's plugged in right and everything's set up according to the instructions. That's like installation qualification, or IQ, in the pharma world.
Okay.
Then you test if it heats up to the right temperatures, if the timer works, all that. That would be like operational qualification, or OQ.
I see. So it's not just about having the equipment. It's about making sure it actually works as intended.
Exactly. And then comes the real test. You bake a few batches of your favorite cookies. If they come out perfect every time, that shows your oven can reliably do its job. That's like performance qualification, or PQ. The Miltenyi Biotech video and some stuff from our past seasons cover this whole qualification thing really well. It's all about proving the equipment is up to snuff.
Okay, IQ, OQ, PQ. Got it. It's like a triple check system for the equipment. What else is in Subpart D?
It's also all about calibration, making sure those balances, thermometers, all those tools are giving accurate readings. That comes up in the EAS Consulting Group videos and also in one of our past deep dives on good laboratory practices, GLP.
Calibration. Yeah, like tuning a guitar to make sure it plays the right notes. Okay, so we've got the facilities, the equipment, all checked out. Now, what about the actual stuff that goes into making the drugs, the raw materials and all that? Where are the rules for those?
That's where Subpart E steps in. Control of components and drug product containers and closures. This one's all about strict procedures, written down and followed to the letter for everything. From when those materials arrive, making sure they are what they say they are, all the way to how they're stored and tested before they can be used.
So they can't just trust whatever the supplier sends them. They've got to verify everything, right?
Absolutely. Every single batch of those components, the containers, the closures, everything, they've got to be tested carefully to make sure they meet the quality standards. And it's the quality control unit, the QC folks, who have the final say on whether those materials are good to go or not.
Okay, so QC, they're the gatekeepers here. Makes sense.
This is actually covered in Section 211.84 of the CFR and that helpful video on good documentation practices. Documentation is key here, so QC can track everything. Now, once they've got all those quality-checked ingredients, The next step is actually making the drug. That's subpart F territory, right? Production and process controls.
Yeah, subpart F, the heart of the operation, I guess. What's the focus there?
This is where those detailed written instructions for making the drug really matter. Every single person involved has to follow them precisely. And it's not just about following steps, it's about checking along the way. They call these in-process controls.
Oh, so like if they're mixing something, they're checking the temperature, the pH, all that as they go.
Exactly. These in-process controls are like checkpoints throughout the process, making sure everything is going right, and the final product will meet all those quality standards.
Sounds like a lot of checking and double checking.
It is, but it's crucial, especially when we're talking about things like preventing contamination, which is a big deal for sterile products like injections. And then there's process validation, where they prove scientifically that the whole manufacturing process, if done correctly, will make a good quality product every time.
Process validation, that sounds complicated.
Oh, it definitely can be. There are whole guidelines and books about it. One that comes to mind is Syed Imtiaz Haider's book, Pharmaceutical Master Validation Plan. It just goes to show how important this is.
All right, so let's say they've made the drug, followed all the procedures. Next step, got to package it up, label it correctly. I guess that's where subpart G comes in. Packaging and labeling control.
You're right on track. This part's all about keeping tight control over all those materials, labels, packaging, everything. It's about making sure the right label is used for the right drug and strength, that the labels are printed correctly, and even keeping track of how many labels are printed and used just to avoid any chance of a mix-up.
Wow, label mix-ups, that could be really bad.
It could be disastrous. Someone could end up taking the wrong medicine or the wrong dose, all because of a labeling error. So the regulations are super strict here. They even require tamper-evident packaging for over-the-counter drugs, like those seals you see on bottles.
Yeah, I know those. So those are there because of these cGMP regulations.
Exactly. All those details are in sections 211.122, 211.125, and 211.132 of the CFR.
Okay, lots of regulations for that. So the drug is made, it's packaged up, labeled correctly. What happens next?
Now it's time for testing. Subpart laboratory controls. This is where they make sure the final product actually meets all those quality standards.
Ah, the quality check at the end.
Not just at the end. They do testing all along the way. But this subpart lays out the requirements for the labs themselves. They need the right facilities, they need to use scientifically sound methods for testing, and they need qualified people doing the testing.
It makes sense, but where do those testing methods come from? Are they just making them up?
Oh, no, not at all. The EAS Consulting Group has a video where they talk about this, and they mention a bunch of recognized sources for these methods. There's the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, or USP, the Association of Official Analytical Chemists, AOAC, the Food Chemicals Codex, FCC, even the EPA has methods for things like testing for contaminants.
Wow, so it's a whole science in itself, figuring out how to test these drugs.
Oh, for sure. And like we talked about with process validation, the testing methods themselves also need to be validated to make sure they're reliable. This actually came up in one of our previous seasons, too.
Right, got to make sure the tests are actually testing what they're supposed to test.
Absolutely. So we have these qualified people using proven methods and properly equipped labs to test these drugs at various stages. Then what?
Well, they've got to keep track of all those test results, right? Lots and lots of documentation, I'm guessing.
You're getting good at this. That's subpart J, records and reports. This part is all about keeping detailed, accurate records of basically everything that happens.
So if it isn't written down, it didn't happen.
That's the mantra in the pharmaceutical world, and they really emphasize that in the EAS Consulting Group's videos on this topic. These records are crucial, not just to prove to the FDA that they're following the rules, but also to help them improve their processes, to track down any problems, to basically have a history of what happened.
Okay, so what kind of records are we talking about specifically?
Everything. They need master production records, like a super detailed recipe for each product. Then there are batch records, which track the making of each specific batch of the drug. Equipment logs track all the equipment they use, when it was maintained, calibrated, all that. And of course, all those testing records, from raw materials to in-process checks to the final product testing. Even if someone complains about a product, that gets recorded and investigated.
Wow, sounds like a ton of paperwork.
It can be, but it's super important. And this is a big topic in one of our earlier deep dives too, where we talk about all those requirements for record keeping in Part 211. The CFR sections 211.188A, 211.186, and 211.198 lay it all out.
So every step, every little detail, it's all got to be documented. Now, what about those situations where, say, a drug gets returned to the manufacturer, or maybe it needs to be salvaged? Is there a specific part of the CFR that covers that?
Yep, there's a subpart for that too. Subpart K, return and salvage drug products. Section 211.204 of the CFR lays out what they need to do in those situations.
So Part 211, it really does cover everything from A to Z of making a medicine. You mentioned earlier some other CFR parts that are relevant too.
Right, like Part 314, that's for new drug applications. Before a company can sell a new drug in the U.S., they have to go through this whole process, and obviously following cGMP is a must. Then there's Part 312 for investigational new drugs. Those are the drugs used in clinical trials.
Right. So even before a drug is approved for sale?
Exactly. And those drugs are still expected to be made following GMP, even though they're still being tested. Charisma actually talks about this in the FDA CITC Day 2 transcript. It was really interesting. And there's Part 320, which covers bioavailability and bioequivalence studies. These studies are often done for generic drugs to show they work the same way as the brand name drug. And to make sure those studies are reliable, the quality of the drugs they're testing has to be consistent.
Yeah, makes sense. Consistent quality is key for all these studies and tests.
And then there's Part 58. This was not exactly cGMP, but it's related. It's about good laboratory practices, GLP, for all those non-clinical lab studies they do before testing a drug in humans. This actually came up in that FDA CITC Day 2 transcript, too.
Right, so it's not just about how you make the drug, it's about all the testing and research that goes into it as well.
Exactly. There are rules and guidelines for every step of the way, from early research to the final product on the shelf. Think of it like this. Part 211 is the super detailed instruction manual for the physical making of the medicine. All these other regulations, like Part 314 for new drugs or the GLP rules, they tell you why you have to do all that and provide a bigger context for the whole process.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a super complex web of regulations and guidelines. And it's not just the US, we've got the international scene too. You mentioned the International Council for Harmonization, the ICH, before. What's their role in all of this?
The ICH is all about trying to get everyone on the same page globally. We talked about this a bit in a previous deep dive, remember. They work to make sure those standards for pharmaceutical quality are more or less the same around the world.
Right, so it doesn't matter if a drug is made in the US, Europe, or somewhere else. The quality should be about the same.
That's the goal. And they've created some really important guidelines. One of the big ones is ICH Q9, which is all about quality risk management. They basically want companies to be proactive, to think about what could go wrong, and have plans in place to prevent those problems from happening.
So like a what-if plan for quality.
Exactly. It's about identifying those potential risks, figuring out how likely they are to happen and how bad they could be, and then putting controls in place to minimize those risks.
I guess that makes sense. You can't always predict everything, but you can try to be prepared.
Right. And ICHQ9 provides this whole framework for doing this systematically, using science and risk assessment tools. Some of the tools that are commonly used, like HACCP, that's hazard analysis and critical control points, and FMEA, failure mode and effects analysis, they come up in those books you shared.
Oh, okay. So they have specific methods for figuring out the risks and how to control them? Sounds pretty thorough.
It is, and both drug manufacturers and regulators rely on this guidance a lot. The ICHQ9 document goes into a lot of detail. And there are other important ICH guidelines, too.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Like ICH-Q11, which focuses on making drug substances the active ingredient in the medicine. This one's all about picking the right starting materials and really controlling those impurities that might sneak in.
Impurities. Yeah, that makes sense. You don't want anything extra in there that could cause problems.
Exactly. And the ICH-Q11 Q&A video is really helpful for understanding all the specifics. Then you've got guidelines like ICH-Q3A, which lays out acceptable levels of impurities in new drugs, and ICH-M7, which is specifically about mutagenic impurities, the ones that could potentially cause cancer.
Okay, so basically a whole bunch of guidelines to make sure those drugs are super pure and safe.
Right. All of this ties back to those critical quality attributes we talked about earlier. And it doesn't stop there. Even the way they report the results from clinical trials, there's a guideline for that, ICH-E3. It's all interconnected because you need consistently good quality in the drug they're testing for those results to be reliable.
Wow, it really is a complex web.
It is. There are even more guidelines like ICHQ Skitse on specifications, which outlines the standards a drug has to meet, and ICHQ-5C, which is specifically for biologics. Those are complex medicines made from living organisms.
Biologics, yeah, those are becoming more and more common. So all these ICH guidelines, they're like a global set of standards for making sure medicines are safe and effective no matter where they're made.
Exactly. Part 211 gives you the U.S.-specific rules, but medicines and their ingredients are traded globally, right? The ICH helps ensure that a medicine made in one country is of similar quality to one made elsewhere, building trust and consistency across the whole supply chain.
Yeah, makes sense. But we talked earlier about how cGMP isn't just about following the rules, it's also about creating a culture of quality within a company.
Absolutely. It's not just about checking boxes and filling out paperwork. cGMP has to be a mindset, a way of thinking for everyone in the company. They need to understand why it matters and take responsibility for ensuring quality. Ajaz S. Hussain, a real expert in this area, has a great video on how important this cultural aspect of quality is.
So it's as much about the people as it is about the procedures, right?
Totally. You could have the most detailed procedures in the world, but if the people aren't trained well or don't care about quality, it all falls apart. That's why 21 CFR Part 211 is very clear about the need for qualified, trained personnel. Everyone, from the scientists to the folks on the production line, they all play a role in making sure the final product is safe and effective.
And it's not like those rules are set in stone, right? cGMP, the C stands for current, so it's always evolving.
That's right. Current means you got to keep up with the times, the science, the new technologies, the latest regulations. This was actually something we discussed in past season too. Continuous improvement, that's a big part of cGMP.
So like always striving to do things better.
Exactly. And that often involves what they call KPA, corrective and preventive actions. Whenever they find a problem or something goes wrong, they don't just fix it, they try to figure out how to prevent it from happening again.
Okay, so learning from mistakes and making changes to improve things. There's a book by Rodriguez Perez on CAPA law, and the FDA did a whole workshop on their Office of Surveillance and Inspection Systems, OSIS, that also talked about how important CAPA is.
Now think about all those companies that supply the raw materials, the containers, all that stuff. There are even companies that do testing for other companies, like contract labs. They're all part of the picture too, right?
Oh yeah, they all play a role in making sure the final drug is good.
Exactly. And making sure your suppliers are good is a big deal. That means carefully picking and qualifying those contract labs, making sure they meet all the standards. The EAS Consulting Group did a video on contract labs, and there's also a book called The Supplier Management Handbook by Bossert that goes into all the nitty-gritty of this.
So it really is a team effort. Everyone in the supply chain has to be on board with this quality thing. Now, how does the FDA actually make sure all these companies are following the rules? They inspect them, right?
That's the main way. The FDA sends inspectors to those manufacturing facilities, both in the U.S. and overseas, to make sure they're following cGMP. Devon Edwards talks about this in one of his videos, and it's also mentioned in the FDA CITC Day 3 transcript.
So what are those inspectors looking for?
They're checking if the facilities are up to par, if the equipment is maintained properly, if they're controlling those materials and ingredients correctly, if they're sticking to those validated processes, if the packaging and labeling is accurate, if the labs are doing things right, if the records are complete and correct, if the whole company has that quality mindset. They're basically looking for proof that everything's being done right to ensure the quality of those drugs.
And if they find problems, what happens?
Well, there are a few different outcomes. The best one is NAI, no action indicated, meaning they didn't find any big issues. Then there's VAI, voluntary action indicated. This means they found some minor things that need to be fixed, but it's not serious enough to take regulatory action.
Okay, so like a warning, but not a full-blown penalty?
Exactly. But then there's OAI, official action indicated. This is when they find serious problems, things that don't comply with cGMP. That's when things can get a bit more serious.
Oh, AI, that sounds bad.
Yeah, that's not good. The Understanding FDA Inspections video explains all these different classifications. If a facility gets hit with an OAI, the FDA can issue a warning letter.
Oh, so it's like getting a formal reprimand.
Yeah, it's official. They list out all the violations, and the company has to fix them. If they don't, things can escalate.
Escalate, like what could happen?
Well, they could face a recall of their product. They could even be banned from importing those products into the U.S. And in the worst cases, they could face legal action, fines, even criminal charges, especially if it seems like they intentionally violated the rules. Devon Edwards talks about all this in his video.
So it's not something to be taken lightly.
Definitely not. And during the inspection, the FDA will typically document their observations on a form called Form 4A3. The company has to respond to those observations and, more importantly, actually take action to correct those problems. It's all about accountability.
Right. Now, there is also mention of something called the FDA's Bioresearch Monitoring Program.
Right, the BIMO program. This one's all about clinical trials, making sure the data from those trials is reliable and accurate. This is super important because this data is what the FDA uses to decide whether to approve a new drug or not.
Yeah, I guess if the data is bad, the FDA might make the wrong decision.
Exactly. Cara Alaro actually presented on this program in the FDA CITC Day 3 transcript. It's worth checking out if you want to learn more.
Okay, so they inspect those trials to make sure everything's done right. And I think there was something about remote assessments, too.
Yeah, remote assessments. That's something newer the FDA is doing. They're basically like virtual inspections, or they might review documents remotely.
Oh, interesting. So not always having to send inspectors to a physical location.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Emily Jeva actually talked about this in FDA CITC Day 3 transcript. She said it's becoming a more important tool for the FDA.
Sounds like the FDA's got to be flexible and adapt to how things are changing.
For sure, they're constantly evolving.
Okay, to wrap things up, what are the big consequences for a company that doesn't follow cGMP?
They can be pretty bad. We talked about warning letters, product recalls, legal action, all that. It can cost them a lot of money, damage their reputation, and in the worst cases, people could get hurt if a drug isn't made properly. It also erodes trust in the whole pharmaceutical industry, which is not good for anyone.
Yeah, definitely a lot at stake. Okay, let's recap the key takeaways for our listeners. What's the big picture here?
The most important thing to remember is that quality has to be baked into every step of making a medicine. From designing the facility to picking ingredients to making the drug, testing it, documenting everything, quality is non-negotiable. And of course, you have to follow all those rules in the CFR and those ICH guidelines. But beyond all that, it's about having a real culture of quality within a company where everyone understands their role in making safe and effective medicines.
And it really hits home when you look at past mistakes, like the thalidomide tragedy. That was a huge wake-up call.
It was. The book Wonder Drug tells the story of thalidomide, and it's a stark reminder of what can happen when we don't have those rigorous quality controls. The birth defects caused by that drug, they show the real-world consequences, the human cost of not taking quality seriously.
Really makes you think. But
Well,
there are also positive examples, right? Like that company we talked about in a previous deep dive, the one that aced an FDA inspection because their documentation was so thorough.
absolutely. Their meticulous record-keeping showed the FDA they were really committed to quality. It shows that these aren't just theoretical rules, they have a real impact on preventing harm and making sure people have access to safe and effective medicines.
For sure. So to our listeners, if you're interested in learning more, check out the CFR, the ICH guidelines. You can even dive into the history of GMP. It's pretty fascinating to see how it evolved.
And here's something to ponder. Medicines are made and sold all over the world now. How can we improve global collaboration, make those cGMP standards even more consistent across countries to make sure every medicine, everywhere, is safe and effective? That's a big question. And finding solutions could have a huge impact on global health.
Yeah, definitely something to think about.